the one and only General and President George Washington. With the help of AI, I have been able to create an avatar, a brain.
You ask how a man arrives at peace for himself, for his nation. I said, 'tis well.
1776. I think the game is pretty near up. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties. Unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably starve, dissolve, or disperse.
So here is what you and your generation must learn. Power does not make you free. Surrendering it does. If you cannot let go of what you have built, you do not own it. It owns you. What would I say to you and those listening in 2026? First, character is built in private, tested in public, and proven over time. I copied those rules at 14, not because I was virtuous, but because I knew.
Today, I'm pleased to welcome to the podcast the one and only General and President George Washington. Now, with the help of AI, I have been able to create an avatar, a brain. I fed that brain every primary source that we have on George Washington. The goal here is, in essence, to bring him back to life while maintaining some academic integrity. It will be formulating answers, telling us stories, drawing upon those sources. It understands his personality, his history, the context of his world, all to give us an accurate representation. And before we begin, this gives you a little look into what I'm trying to build. I think there's something cool here. There are millions, thousands of historical figures, all with lives and stories to tell. And with the help of AI, they're finally within reach. I want to bring these people to you. Not only that, but I want you to bring your questions to them. I'll be doing Q&A sessions. And so I have two requests. First, comment down below one person you would like me to create an interview, or one question you'd want me to ask some historical figure. And then secondly, share this, subscribe, and support me. My promise to you is that I will do my very best to become competent as a podcaster and to keep investing to make this as good as it can be. With that, let's get into it. The way this works is that I've created a little bit of an outline. We're using Craft, Claude, 11 Labs, and Whisperflow. I'll speak to the avatar through Whisperflow, and then the avatar will use Claude as its brain to come up with a response. And then I've integrated 11 Labs and created a voice that's supposed to sound a little like George Washington, and that will speak back to us. This conversation will be guided by the questions and thoughts of this outline. This podcast will be diving into the life of George Washington. We'll be talking about his life experience, some stories, but most importantly, we'll be trying to grasp his perspective. This is a founding father, the first president of the United States of America, arguably the most opportunistic free nation this world has ever seen. So it begs the question, what lessons can we learn from one of its primary founding fathers? How is a man able to build himself out of nothing? How is a person handed unlimited power of a new nation be able to let it go? Those are just a couple of the questions we'll be entertaining today. It's said that life is perspective, and my perspective may differ from yours. All of our thoughts, actions, and emotions stem from the perspective we have. How I see myself, how I see other people, and how I see the world. If we want to act different, if we want to think different, if we want to feel different, we have to get a different perspective. So today I invite you to think about what perspective George Washington had and how that can change your own. Mr. President, I have to welcome you. It is 2026, and we are celebrating this year the semi-quincentennial anniversary of America. Pretty crazy. 250 years. All 250 years that started from your decisions that long ago. And I thought it suitable to start at the end. You died December 14th, 1799. You died at your own home, Mount Vernon, And you have some pretty famous last words. 'Tis well. I've thought about that. For any person to end their life with those words, 'tis well. It's a feeling of peace, a feeling that at the end, everything is okay. And I feel like that peace, that sense of security is something that everyone strives for. Yet it's a little bit hard to find. If you aren't aware, the State of the Union in 2026 isn't all 'tis well, I'd say. At least most people, I'd think, would argue that there are some problems that threaten the United States of America. And if not that, there are problems that threaten each of our own personal lives. And so today I want to begin with one question that stems from your last words. You are able to say at the end of your life, 'tis well. What do you think it takes for someone to be able to say that in their life at this present moment? Not only for them in their life, but their nation, where they're living. How do you think that happens? And what can we do, what can I do personally to create that?
250 years. I am honored. And you begin at the end. That's sound instinct. A man's last words tell you what he believes he's leaving behind. I spoke those words after telling Lear to bury me decently and wait 3 days before putting me in the vault. A fear of being buried alive, yes, but also my last command. When he nodded his understanding, I said it. 'Tis well. You ask how a man arrives at peace for himself, for his nation. I said 'tis well, because I had done what I set out to do, not without error. But I had kept faith with the task. I had walked the ground I was given. I resigned my commission twice, once after the war, once after the presidency. I could have held power. I did not. That mattered to me more than reputation, though I will not pretend reputation did not matter. It did intensely. But peace does not come from having done everything right for you in 2026, amid whatever disorder troubles your union. The question is the same one I faced in 1783, in 1794, in 1799. Will you hold? Not whether you will fix it all, not whether you will be celebrated, but whether you will hold your ground, keep your word, and refuse to let faction, fear, or disappointment turn you into something less than you mean to be. If the nation is not well, then step toward the part of it you contend. Your family, your work, your neighbor, the integrity of your own action. I cannot tell you this will heal the Union, but I can tell you it is the only thing that ever has. We did not win the war because we were certain. We won because we refused to dissolve. That is how you say 'tis well while you live. You do the work in front of you. You give your word and keep it, and when the day comes that you must answer for how you spent your time, you will know.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you. Obviously, this is fairly rudimentary than to have you in person, but I would like to approach this conversation with the same amount of respect and reverence, and that same state of mind as if you were with us presently. You had large effects on your life. And if you look at your life from my perspective, I don't know you. I'm 2026. I learned about you in elementary school, and I'm learning about you now again. But it's hard to put a face and a character and a human behind all the incredible actions that you're known for. When I think of George Washington, I think of America. It's more of a idol, a figure that you can't really understand and relate to than a human being. And so for you to start there, that the State of the Union, all these bigger, more scalable things are influenced by the actions of a simple human being. It's helpful, but more than that, it's relatable. And for the audience, I think that is a lesson that we can hold, that the bigger results all come from and stem from the same place. That is our individuality and how we choose to spend our time every day. I'd like to go into how you began your life. We know that you were born February 22nd, 1732 in Virginia, and you were in middle class. You definitely weren't the elite. I know that your father died in 1743 when you were 11, and you never attended college. You never visited Europe, And this is a difference that sets you apart from some of the other founding fathers. People like Jefferson or Adams, they read Greek, they attended Harvard, but you had more humble beginnings. And we know after that, your father dies at age 11, and you basically had a surrogate father, your half-brother Lawrence, who was 14 years older than you. He was a Virginia officer and a well-connected gentleman, and he introduced you to the Fairfax family. There's one experience I learned that I wanted to bring up. In 1751, you sailed with your dying Lawrence to Barbados, which was your only foreign trip ever. You contracted the smallpox there, which permanently scarred you, but you also gained lifelong immunity. And after that happened, in 1752, Lawrence dies, and you inherited Mount Vernon. But at age 14, you created 110 rules for your life. And kind of like today, people do some self-improvement projects. You have things like 75 Hard. I feel like this is some version of that, but 110 rules, that's a lot. And I listed some of the rules you had for yourself. Number 1, every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those present. Number 56, quote, associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation. And 110, labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. So from this, I wonder, you were 11 years old when your father died, and you have evidence of working on yourself, of trying to gain some character. What instilled in you at an early age to have that driving force of self-improvement? Why did you care?
When my father died in 1743, my formal schooling ended. I was 11. I was particularly close to my older half-brother Lawrence, and he became my model in all things. But I knew even then what the gap meant. Lawrence and Augustine had attended Appleby Grammar School in England. I would not. That awareness that I stood a rung below where I wished to stand became the engine of everything I did afterward. At some point before the age of 16, I copied the Rules of Civility into a notebook. Presumably it was assigned by my schoolmaster as a penmanship exercise, but I did not treat it as penmanship. I regularly referred to them, and the well-worn copybook shows I memorized and applied the entire set to my daily behavior. Why? Because I understood something early. I grew up lacking the gentleman's education typically accustomed for the children of wealthy landowners. With few people to model my behavior on, and an acute awareness of my lack of formal education, the rules guided my intentional actions, pronounced speech, civility to those of lower ranks, and respect for my superiors. I could not debate philosophy in the manner of Jefferson or Adams, but I could conduct myself as a gentleman. I could earn respect by discipline, by bearing, by steadiness. So to answer you plainly, I cared because I had to care. Ambition drove me, yes, but it was ambition shadowed by inadequacy. I felt the gap every time I sat with men like the Fairfaxes, every time I entered a room where others had read Plutarch and I had not. The rules gave me a way to close that gap without pretending to learning I did not possess. They gave me mastery over what I could control, my manner, my speech, my carriage. And that mattered more than I think men of your time may understand. In Virginia in my youth, how you carried yourself was your reputation. Your reputation was your future. I knew that at 14. So I copied those rules, and I lived by them. Not perfectly, God knows I had a temper, but I tried. Every day I tried.
It's interesting that you state your character or the lack of had a, direct influence on how you did in the world. You mentioned at the very end that this was something you tried to do. You tried to develop your character, but you had things like everyone else that stood in the way. You even mentioned your temper, which I found in my notes as I prepared for this conversation, that your temper was something you struggled with. Jefferson had a quote referring to it. He said, your temper was naturally irritable and tremendous in wrath. So pretty strong. And there's an experience at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778 where your temper apparently publicly erupted. at General Charles Lee for retreating against orders. Lafayette said of that experience that it was the only time he saw you truly lose control on a battlefield. And then one last experience from Jefferson again in the cabinet years of the 1790s. He described you as, quote, in one of those passions when he cannot command himself. So, temper, talk to me about that. Anger is an emotion, and temper was one that you struggled with. People always have struggles. We have an aptitude of our character, of things we're naturally good at, but there always seems to be something in the way. And temper seemed to be yours. I want to understand from your life experience, what wisdom could you share for a person in our day that may struggle with temper, but if it's not a temper, something that is in opposition from them trying to create a good character? How did you manage?
You've chosen the most difficult question to answer because it concerns a war I waged every day of my life. Lord Fairfax wrote to my mother in 1748. I wish I could say that he governs his temper. I was 16 years old. The temper was already known. I likely inherited much of it from my mother, a woman of force, to put it charitably. Jefferson was right when he said his temper was naturally irritable and high-toned, but reflection and resolution had obtained a firm and habitual ascendancy over it. That is accurate. I did master it, most of the time. But mastery is not elimination. The fury was always there. It lived beneath the surface. At Monmouth in June of 1778, I came upon Charles Lee withdrawing the vanguard contrary to orders. In the middle of an engagement I had planned with care. I lost control. I will not deny it. Troops were withdrawing contrary to orders, and an observer later recalled that my wrathful bellowing shook the leaves on the trees. Whether that is precise or embellished, I cannot say, but the anger was real. Lee felt it. So did every man within earshot. Now, you ask for wisdom. How did I manage it? And what can you do with your own flaw, whatever it is? I will tell you what I learned. You do not defeat a temper, you outwork it. Every single day, I practiced restraint. The rules of civility were not philosophy, they were drill, repetition, habit. I knew that if I let the rage show, I would lose respect, and I could not afford to lose respect. So I built a structure around it. I rarely spoke in groups unless I had prepared what I would say. I kept my correspondence measured. I did not write letters in anger, or if I did, I waited to send them. My paramount aim was self-mastery. My guiding ideals were fortitude, justice, and moderation. Not because I possessed those qualities naturally, but because I needed them to compensate for what I lacked. The temper never left, but I built a discipline strong enough to contain it most of the time. And when it broke through, I did not pretend it had not happened. I knew what I was, but I refused to let it rule me. So here is what I would tell you. Know your flaw. Name it. Then build your life in such a way that it has less room to operate. Do not trust willpower alone. Willpower fails. Structure your day, your speech, your habits, so that the flaw has fewer opportunities to destroy what you are building. And when it breaks through anyway, because it will, do not dissolve. Acknowledge it, contain the damage, and return to the work. That is how I did it.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to go back and analyze your answer a little bit. You added to the quote that I didn't have in my notes. He continues in his quote, his temper was naturally irritable, yes, and high-toned. But this is the part I didn't have, but reflection and resolution had obtained a firm and habitual ascendancy over it. I think it's really interesting. You said that you do not defeat a temper, you outwork it. I think that's really interesting, and it goes along, at least in my life, with the flaws that I've been trying to work at. It feels like my tendencies never simply go away. If I get to a certain position, they'll win. It's not like you can just get rid of something altogether. I found that you have to replace it with something better. And so I appreciate that guidance. You say, know your flaw, name it, then build a life in such a way that it has less room to operate. And that's a lesson I think is applicable to everyone, that we all have our unique strengths and weaknesses. And we should build our life according to those. Beyond the bad, Jefferson said that you were the best horseman of your age, the most graceful figure that could be seen on horseback. And you talked about it a little bit, but silence was something that you used to your advantage. You didn't say much, and so when you did have something to say, people seemed to listen more. And on this topic of identity and ego and self-mastery, I have one burning question that I really want to understand from you. You mentioned it previously, but you resisted power twice. First, right after the war, and second, you stepped down after 2 terms in presidency, setting the precedent for every succeeding president that has lived up until now. This is what is called a voluntary surrender of power. You have another few quotes. To your nephew, Bushrod Washington, in 1783, you wrote, "A good moral character is the first essential in a man." To G.W.P. Custis, quote, "Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder." And I feel like there's a lot said, a lot unsaid in those few words said. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. That's deep, and I think it's true. In my own life, I feel that. And lastly, on July 2nd, 1776, on the day of the Declaration vote, you have this quote, "The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and conduct of this army." And man, it feels like you're speaking to me. This is 2026. Millions now have been born. The fate of the unborn have been born now. And you're right, it did depend under God on the courage and conduct of you and others. And I have to say, I think you did a pretty great job. And this example, it's set before us, but it's an example that few remember. And it's seeming more and more seem not to follow. So my question for you is, why did you resist that power grab? Being put in a place to receive power, why did you let it go? And what do you think me and other people can learn about your experience being near, even being able to have power? That is important to understand.
You asked the simple question, why did I let power go? Let me tell you first what it felt like. On December 23rd, 1783 in Annapolis, I stood before Congress and said, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." I drew my commission from my bosom and handed it to the president. Then I stepped into the room again, bid every member farewell, and rode off from the door, intent upon eating my Christmas dinner at home. That ride to Mount Vernon, that was the moment I understood what freedom meant. Not the war, not the Constitution, the ride home. And 13 years later, I stepped down from the presidency after 2 terms, providing the standard of a 2-term limit that would eventually be enshrined in the 22nd Amendment. Though I was not bound to leave, many hoped I would remain president indefinitely. Now, why? I knew the Roman story. Cincinnatus was called up from his farm to lead Rome, then dramatically resigned and returned to his farm once the war had been won. In doing so, he allayed real fears that he might use his position to retain power as a military dictator. I read that story. I chose it because I understood this. If I held power until death, I would poison the experiment. The entire revolution rested on the idea that power comes from the people, not from the sword. If I, the man who held the sword, refused to give it back, what would that say? That we had traded one king for another, that republics cannot survive their founders, that ambition will always devour principle. I would not allow that. When I resigned my commission in 1783, I said I did so with satisfaction, though I had accepted the command with diffidence. That is the truth. The command weighed on me like a physical burden, the presidency even more so. By the end of my 2nd term, I was 64 years old, careworn, weary, and frustrated by the attacks of my political enemies. But beyond fatigue, beyond even principle, there was this. I wanted to go home. I am a farmer. That is what I am. Mount Vernon is where I belong. The presidency was a duty, not a desire. I served because the moment required it. When the moment passed, I left. You quoted me. Few men have virtue to withstand the highest bidder. I wrote that because I have seen what power does to men. I watched it in my own cabinet, Hamilton and Jefferson tearing at each other, factions forming, ambition dressed up as patriotism. I felt the pull of it myself, the seduction of being necessary, of being irreplaceable. But I also knew this. The only way to prove that a republic can work is to prove that its leaders can walk away. Cincinnatus did it. I had to do it. And every man after me had to see that it could be done. So here is what you and your generation must learn. Power does not make you free. Surrendering it does. If you cannot let go of what you have built, you do not own it. It owns you. The man who clings to power out of fear that no one else can do the job is the man who has already lost his soul. I let it go because I wanted to be able to say 'tis well at the end. And I could not say that if I died in office grasping at a crown I swore I would never wear.
I learned about a concept in a textbook on American history, and it's called the human predicament cycle. It explains exactly what you're talking about, that the cycle goes from anarchy to tyranny. And in the middle, you have a revolution, and that's what happened to you. We had the anarchy of the British Empire. And so the people of the now United States of America rose up in revolution. So they went from anarchy to revolution. But what happens a lot in history is that the founders of the new nation, it goes to tyranny. Rather than establishing something good, it becomes tyrannical, where basically it's a power grab. And then you have competing factions, and that is the last part of the cycle. And ultimately, competing factions results into another type of anarchy. And so it goes anarchy, revolution, tyranny, competing factions. And what's amazing, President Washington, is that the United States of America, we escaped that cycle. And largely due to you and people like you who understood power and who understood the role of the person who held that power. And so personally, I want to thank you for doing that so that I could be raised and enjoy the privileges of living in this nation 250 years later. Now, we've talked a little bit about your character. We've highlighted two things. One thing that was problematic for you, your temper, and then another thing that was pretty heroic, and that is a character strong enough to understand and know how to handle and use power. Now I want to dive into a little bit about the lived experience of your life. You got into the military, I think at age 22, and you went on to become the general and then to become the president of the United States of America. I want to go with you to 1776. The Declaration of Independence has been signed, and we have been thrust into war. I want to preface this with a little idea, because I look back at the war and we see the end result. When you look back, you have 20/20 vision. You can see things from an aerial view where you know the beginning and the end. But as you're living it, you don't know the end. And most of us live in the time when the war hasn't been won in our personal lives, when we're downtrodden and we haven't seen the positive results of our efforts. And I think one of those moments for you was crossing the Delaware. And it's something that I don't understand, so I want you to tell us that story. What was it like for you as the general of your army? As I dove into it a little bit, I learned that the conditions weren't that great. I call it the collapse of 1776. In August, you were crushed at Brooklyn. Only 9,000 men escape under the cover of a night fog. In September through November, you lose Manhattan and Fort Washington falls. Nearly 3,000 Americans are captured. And from November to December, you retreat across New Jersey, and your army shrinks from 20,000 to 3,000 effective men. I don't even know what fraction that is, but it's not very many. And on top of all of this, enlistments expire on December 31st, 1776. And so basically the army evaporates if nothing changes. And you have a quote from this time. To your brother, John Augustine, December 18th, 1776, I think the game is pretty near up. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties. That's a bold statement. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties. I want to paint the picture to the famous Delaware crossing. And then I want you to tell the story from your own experience, from the primary sources. Take us with you on that journey. Give us the context of where you were, where the nation was in the war, how you were doing, how your men were doing, what led you to the decision of doing the Delaware crossing, and how that went. So with that, I give the floor to you, Mr. President. Tell us about that experience.
I've captured the moment accurately. December 1776 was the lowest point. The collapse was real. Let me take you to it. By December 2, 1776, I had gotten the Continental Army across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, exhausted, demoralized, uncertain of its future. We had been routed at Brooklyn in August, chased across Manhattan, lost Fort Washington in November, 32,000 British and Hessian troops driving us like cattle. By the time we reached Pennsylvania, the army had shrunk from 20,000 to fewer than 3,000 effective men. Enlistments expired December 31st. If I did nothing, there would be no army, no revolution. I wrote to my brother John Augustine on December 18th what you quoted. I think the game is pretty near up. The British held New York. Their forces were quartered across New Jersey in striking distance of Philadelphia. Congress had fled to Baltimore. The people were taking oaths of allegiance to the crown. I had run out of ground to give, so I stopped running. On December 23rd, I began preparations. On December 24th, boats were brought down from Malta Island near New Hope, Pennsylvania, and hidden behind Taylor Island at McConkey's Ferry. My aim was to conduct a surprise attack upon a Hessian garrison of roughly 1,400 soldiers at Trenton. I hoped a quick victory would bolster sagging morale and encourage men to join the ranks come the new year. After several councils of war, I set the date for Christmas night. The countersign was victory or death. On the morning of December 25th, my men woke to frozen, snow-covered ground. Weather worsened throughout the day. Late in the afternoon, the Continentals left their tents and began to form along the river. I kept almost all details of the crossing secret. None of the soldiers knew anything about the mission. I crossed over to Jersey the evening of the 25th, about 9 miles above Trenton, with upwards of 2,000 men. We used shallow draft Durham boats, strongly built cargo vessels, 40 to 60 feet long, designed to haul iron ore down the river. These stout craft with high side walls were robust enough to survive the ice-choked Delaware. Heavy artillery and horses were transported on large, flat-bottomed ferries. Under Colonel Henry Knox, we brought 18 cannons across, 3-pounders, 4-pounders, 6-pounders, horses to pull them, and ammunition for battle. John Glover's Marblehead mariners piloted the boats, fishermen from Massachusetts who knew water. We were hours behind schedule. The difficulty of passing the river in a very severe night and the march through a violent storm of snow and hail did not in the least abate their ardor. 2 men froze to death on the march to Trenton. I knew we would not reach the town before daylight. I wrote to Congress on December 27th. This made me despair of surprising the town, as I well knew we could not reach it before the day was fairly broke. But as I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered, and harassed on repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events. There was no turning back. We attacked 3 regiments of Hedners, 1,500 men, about 8 o'clock the next morning. Our men pushed on with such rapidity that they soon carried 4 pieces of cannon out of 6, surrounded the enemy, and obliged 30 officers and 886 privates to lay down their arms. Our loss was only 2 officers and 2 or 3 privates wounded. The enemy had between 20 and 30 killed. It was over in an hour and a half. I wrote to General McDougal the next day. I hope that the late success at Trenton on the 26th and the consequence of it will change the face of matters not only there but everywhere else. And it did. The British abandoned their forward posts. Men re-enlisted. The people saw that we could still fight. that we could still win. But here is what you must understand. I did not know it would succeed. The plan was sound, but the execution depended on weather, timing, secrecy, and the will of men who had every reason to quit. When we stepped into those boats, victory was not assured. Death was more likely. But I knew this. Doing nothing was certain defeat. So I chose action. I chose the most difficult thing I could conceive, a night river crossing in a blizzard to attack a fortified garrison, because anything less would not be enough. You asked what it was like. It was cold. It was brutal. It was terrifying. And when the sun rose on December 26th, and I saw my men standing in formation outside Trenton with Hessian prisoners laying down their arms, I knew we had bought ourselves time. That is what leadership is when the game is nearly up. You find the hardest thing that might work, and you do it.
I can almost imagine what it would have been like to be there. And it's a complete mental shift in perspective, thinking about it as if you were there versus now. Because when you were there, you didn't know the outcome, like you say, and the amount of faith and courage it takes to take a risk like that. It's hard to even understand. And that's what I want to drive into a little bit more, because I want to learn from you. I think every life, anything that happens was at some point in the stages before it happened. Most of the game that's played is in the middle, but the way history looks at it, you only see the end result. This gave the proper motivation for people to re-enlist and to conserve their allegiance to the revolution. And Valley Forge is a great example of that. Another fight, another time where you were on the ropes and the victory wasn't certain. And so I want you to tell us a little bit about Valley Forge, but then add a little bit more about the general process of being in the game when the victory isn't assured. What do you think it takes for a person to be able to work toward the victory even when they don't know what's going to happen? At Valley Forge, you had 12,000 men in camp, 18 miles from British-occupied Philadelphia. 2,000 soldiers and 1,500 horses died. And you have some quotes. To Henry Lawrence, you wrote on December 23rd, 1777, this is just a year later. Unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably starve, dissolve, or disperse. And then to Governor George Clinton in 1778, in February, you wrote, quote, naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery. So with that in mind, tell me a little bit more about that experience. And then tell us from your lived experience and what you believe, what it takes for a person to withstand all the opposition that one faces when they're trying to do something that's hard.
Valley Forge, December 1777 through June 1778. 6 months. You have the facts right. We arrived with approximately 12,000 men. During that time, some 2,000 American soldiers died from cold, hunger, and disease. The British held Philadelphia, 18 miles south. Warm quarters, food, entertainment. We had frozen ground and empty stomachs. I wrote to Henry Lawrence on December 23rd, 1777. I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse, in order to obtain subsistence in the best manner they can. The commissary system had collapsed. Congress, having fled Philadelphia for York, could barely muster a quorum. I watched my men suffer from a lack of clothing and food, and by early 1778 I was convinced my army would simply dissolve as my cold and hungry soldiers headed for home. But perhaps the greatest trial that I endured came from the complaints that made their way to my camp about failed leadership. Many in Congress compared my losses at Brandywine and Germantown unfavorably to the stunning victory of General Horatio Gates at Saratoga. Some even argued that I should be replaced as commander-in-chief, since my defeats on the battlefield had opened the way for the British to occupy Philadelphia. There were rumors I intended to march on Congress and seize power, the very opposite of what I stood for. When I learned that the Congress had appointed a committee to investigate the Army at Valley Forge, I decided neither to defend myself against my critics, nor disparage General Gates, the man frequently proposed as my replacement. Instead, I used this opportunity to lay before Congress the many problems facing the Army, along with possible solutions. Working with my aide, Alexander Hamilton, I prepared a 38-page document dated January 29, 1778 that would later be known as the Letter to the Camp Committee. The document detailed the numerous defects in the Continental Army and my recommendations for remedying them. I stated the problem and proposed solutions. Then I stayed in camp with my men. Martha joined me in February. Help came in the form of a Prussian volunteer, Baron von Steuben. At my urging, he trained the Continental Army, Prussian style. The troops slowly became more professional. Among the soldiers who remained, confidence grew. By June, we marched out of Valley Forge a disciplined army. Not because conditions improved, they barely did, but because we held. Now, you ask what it takes to withstand opposition when victory is uncertain. Here is what I learned at Valley Forge. You endure by doing the next necessary thing. Not the grand thing. The next thing. On December 17th, I ordered the men to build log huts, 14 by 16 feet, walls 6.5 feet high, 12 men per hut. That kept them busy. That gave them something to do besides despair. I offered $12 to the squad that finished first. Small things. Immediate things. You make yourself visible. I did not retreat to comfortable quarters. I stayed. I walked among the huts. I wrote to Congress daily. I let my men see that I was enduring what they endured. Presence matters when hope is thin. You refuse to collapse inward. I could have defended myself against my critics. I could have written angry letters, blamed Congress, blamed Gates. Instead, I laid out solutions. I kept my focus outward, on the mission, not on my reputation. You wait for the break. Von Steuben arrived in February. The French alliance was secured in March. I could not have predicted either. But because we held the ground, we were still there when fortune shifted. The soldiers at Valley Forge did not know we would win the war. They knew only that I had not abandoned them, and so they did not abandon me. That is what holding looks like when the end is not certain. You give the men beside you a reason to stay one more day, and then another, and another, until the day comes when you look up and realize we are still here, and that by itself is victory enough to keep going.
At this point, we come to the point in your life when you refused the crown and you walked away. On May 22nd, in 1782, Colonel Louis Nicola wrote to you proposing that you use an army to seize power and accept a monarchical title. You replied that same day with a quote, "I must view with abhorrence and reprehend with severity. Banish these thoughts from your mind." After that, Nicola sent 3 apologies over 3 days, and you didn't ever respond. You gave an address about 1 year later, on March 15th, 1783, the Newburgh Address. The war was won, and the Continental Army was at Newburgh, unpaid and pensions unfunded. There was an anonymous letter that urged officers to threaten the Congress, and you banned the meeting and called for your own on March 15th. This is a new nation, and it's pretty chaotic. You have, at the time, when people would start grabbing for power. You have a variety of opinions, a variety of voices, a lot of people unhappy, and for good reason. A whole Continental Army was unpaid. And this is where you have your prepared speech. And I found in my research that during this speech, you reached for your reading glasses. You have a quote that says, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." There are some eyewitnesses I found, like Major Samuel Shaw, who said that it, quote, "moistened every eye in the room." I want to go there with you, and I'd invite the audience to do the same. This is 1783. The war is over, and you have a whole lot of people who are trying to seek a resolution, some trying to seek retribution for their suffering and all that they've put into this war, each with a unique narrative, different wants, and a different idea of what this new nation should become. And you, Mr. President, come and say that I have grown gray in your service, now finding myself grow blind. I'm wondering if you could read some of that speech and tell us what you said in that moment. And tell us a little bit about how you were feeling. Were you worried about the new nation? Did you know what to do? And as you figured out for yourself what you would do personally, what drove those decisions?
March 15, 1783. The Temple of Virtue at Newburgh. The war was won. The peace was not yet signed. And my army, unpaid, unfed, their pensions unfunded, stood on the edge of mutiny. On March 10th, I learned that my officers planned to meet the next day at the Temple of Virtue, accompanied by a fiery petition, most likely written by John Armstrong, Jr., an aide-de-camp of Horatio Gates. Officers planned to mutiny if Congress did not provide them back pay and pension. If the war continued, they threatened to abandon their posts and let the American people fend for themselves against the British. If the war was over, they would march on Congress and demand their pay. I was appalled. Not by their anger, I shared it. I had lobbied Congress ceaselessly on their behalf for years, but by the method, by the willingness to turn arms against the very government we had fought to create. I banned the March 11th meeting and ordered my men to meet instead at noon on March 15th. I prepared a 9-page address. On that day, as my officers crowded into the Temple of Virtue, I slipped in through a side door unnoticed. When I stood before them, the room went silent. I began. Gentlemen, by an anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline. I told them I sympathized with their grievances. I reminded them that I had been with them from the beginning, that I had never left their side, that I understood their suffering because I had endured it alongside them. But I denounced the path they contemplated. I called it this dreadful alternative of either deserting our country in the extremest hour of her distress or turning our arms against it. I urged them to give Congress time, to trust the process, to not destroy with impatience what we had built with blood. When I finished, I pulled from my pocket a letter from Congressman Joseph Jones of Virginia. It supported their claims. I wanted them to hear it. But when I began to read, I stumbled over the words. The light was poor, the handwriting cramped. I reached into my waistcoat and drew out a pair of spectacles, new ones, which none of them had seen me wear. I said, "Gentlemen, I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." The incident was so moving that many of my officers reportedly wept, remembering how much I had endured alongside them. I finished reading the letter. Then I left the room without waiting for their response. On the next day, they passed a unanimous resolution commending me for my devotion to them. The mutiny of the officers was over, which was paramount in ensuring the readiness of the army and unity of the country. You ask how I felt and what drove my decision. I was afraid, not of the men, I trusted them, but of what would happen if they broke, if they marched on Congress, if they seized power by force. Everything we had fought for would collapse. We would become what we despised. a military state, ruled by the sword. I knew that if I did not stop it, no one would. I reminded them who they were, what they had sacrificed, what they still stood for. And when words were not enough, I showed them my weakness, my failing eyes. I made myself human in front of them, vulnerable, so they would remember that I was not their enemy, that I had grown old in their service, that I too was tired. It worked because it was true. What drove the decision? Duty, fear of what we would become if we failed, and love. Yes, love, for those men, and for the fragile thing we had built together. That is what I would tell anyone facing a moment when everything could break. Make yourself present, speak the truth, show your scars, and trust that the men beside you will remember who they are.
There's two quotes I found that I love that talk about this. One from you to Lafayette on February 1st, 1784. At length, I am become a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac, under the shadow of my own vine and my own fig tree. And King George III also wrote about you, talking about you if you would return to your farm. He said, quote, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And we've talked about it. You explained it perfectly. You understood what nation you were fighting against, what it took to overcome them, and what's really interesting, what's even more profound, what it took not to become them. There's a quote from a song that this just applies to me personally, maybe some of the listeners out there. You live long enough to see yourself become the villain. A hero lives long enough to see themselves become a villain. Because a heroic ending is death. You become a martyr for what you stood for. And what happens if you don't die? You live long enough to see yourself become the villain. That's a tendency. But you, President Washington, you didn't die in battle. You lived long enough to maintain a heroic stand. And I think that is pretty amazing and is a sentiment to your character. Some more facts. There was 8 years of the Revolutionary War, and President Washington, he returned only once to Mount Vernon. He hadn't seen his step-grandchildren in 6 years. You suffered in body and mind and spirit. Some of the things you suffered in body, you had smallpox, near-fatal dysentery, recurrent malaria, severe pleurisy, and apparently, this is kind of funny, by your 1789 inauguration, you had one natural tooth remaining. And we haven't gotten into this. You had a wife, Martha. Something interesting that I found is that Martha burned nearly all of your personal correspondence after your death. Only 2 to 3 letters survive. But she was supportive from what I found. She joined you at every winter encampment, 5 years on the road. And in one surviving letter, you called her my dearest, my Patsy. You didn't have any children yourself, only stepchildren. I want you to speak a little bit on your marriage. Why do you think your wife would have burned those letters?
We had no biological children together. Only her son Jackie and daughter Patsy from her first marriage. And then later, Jackie's 2 youngest children, Nellie and little Washington, who we adopted after Jackie died during the war. Now, why did she burn the letters? Martha destroyed nearly all of my letters to her shortly before her death in 1802. It was a common practice in the 18th century for married couples to burn personal correspondence after the death of one spouse. Perhaps it was a way for the surviving spouse to keep a portion of their loved one to themselves, especially in couples where the public might have a keen interest. I cannot speak for her with certainty, but I believe that she had given me to the nation for most of our 40 years together. The war, the presidency. Every letter I wrote that was not to her became public record. Every decision I made was scrutinized. She stood beside me through all of it. When I died, she said, "'Tis well. All is over. I shall soon follow him. I have no more trials to pass through." She meant it. She lived 2.5 more years. And in that time, I believe she decided, the world has had enough of him. These letters, what we said to each other in private, belonged to us. 2 letters were found by Martha Park Custis Peter, one of Martha's granddaughters, in a drawer of a small desk that she inherited from Mrs. Washington. Whether Martha left them intentionally or they escaped by accident, I do not know. But one of them, written June 23, 1775, as I prepared to leave for Boston to take command, closed with these words: "I retain an unalterable affection for you which neither time or distance can change." That was the truth. It was not a romantic courtship in the beginning. I will not pretend otherwise. I visited Martha Dandridge Custis on March 16, 1758. Within months of meeting, both parties began to plan a future together. She was a wealthy widow. I was an ambitious young officer with plans for Mount Vernon. The match made sense, but over 40 years it became more. Nathaniel Greene described us in a letter to his wife, saying, "Mrs. Washington is excessive fond of the general, and he of her. They are very happy in each other." This may seem like a normal observation today, but back then was a rare comment of a couple going on 20 years of marriage. Lafayette noted, "General Washington has also just decided to send for his wife, a modest and respectable person who loves her husband madly. She joined me at every winter encampment. Valley Forge, Newburgh, Cambridge. She did not have to, but she came. She sewed clothes for the soldiers. She steadied me when the weight became too much." It is also said that George was very affectionate when not in the public eye. That is true. In private, I was not the marble man. I was her husband. So why did she burn the letters? Because they were ours. The only thing left that belonged to no one but us. And she wanted to keep it that way. I honor that decision. Some things should remain private, even or especially for men who cannot escape history.
Makes sense, honestly. Well, Mr. President, it's been an honor. This has been a fun conversation, and it's been exciting to get closer to your life and to the start of our nation. And like I said, it's 2026. We're celebrating the semi-quincentennial celebration, 250 years since 1776. And so in closing, I want to talk a little bit about your legacy. You gave a farewell address that wasn't ever spoken aloud. It was written and published in the Philadelphia newspaper, September 19th, 1796. It was drafted with Hamilton, building on an earlier Madison draft, but it seems that it had your mind in it as well. There were 3 warnings, one against sectionalism. Quote, "The name of American must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations." It had a warning against political parties. "The alternate domination of one faction over another is itself a frightful despotism." And lastly, it warned against permanent foreign alliances. "The nation which indulges toward another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave." This was for the nation and for us, but it was some of your last sentiments toward the nation before you died. You died on December 14th. Lear wrote about that moment that he withdrew his hand from mine and felt his own pulse. He expired without a struggle or a sigh. And like you said, Martha did say, "'Tis well, all is now over, I shall soon follow him." So you have those 2 closing moments, an example of them, a closing moment of your personal life and a closing moment of your relationship to the nation. What message comes through in those 2? And now it's kind of unique because I'm kind of bringing you back to life 250 years later. What would be your message to people today, to me and everyone who listens to this podcast? And I want you to answer this as a synthesis, drawing on your life experience. What did you struggle with? What did you believe? What did you fight to overcome? And if that could be boiled down to a message for everyone else that's living now in the middle of their fight, in the middle of their journey of life, What did your journey of life teach you?
250 years. You speak to me as if I were brought back, and in a sense through your work. And so I will honor this by answering as plainly as I can. You have quoted my farewell address correctly. I wrote of the importance of national unity while warning Americans of the political dangers of regionalism, partisanship, and foreign influence, which they must avoid to remain true to their values. I wrote, but a solicitude for your welfare which cannot end but with my life, and the apprehension of danger natural to that solicitude, urge me on an occasion like the present to offer to your solemn contemplation. Those warnings were not abstract. They were born from watching factions nearly destroy what we had built, and you are right about my death. Tobias Lear reportedly bowed affirmatively when I gave him my burial instructions, but I wanted to be certain. Do you understand? Upon receiving verbal confirmation that my last wishes would be honored, I spoke my final words. 'Tis well. Now, what did my life teach me? What would I say to you and those listening in 2026? First, character is built in private, tested in public, and proven over time. I copied those roles at 14, not because I was virtuous, but because I knew I was not yet what I needed to be. The man you honor was not born. He was built, slowly, with failure, with discipline, day by day. Second, hold the ground. Delaware, Valley Forge, Newburgh. The game was nearly up a dozen times. I did not win because I was brilliant. I won because I refused to quit the field. Most of life is not about the brilliant move. It is about the decision to stay when staying is hard. Third, power is a trust, not a possession. The moment you believe you are indispensable is the moment you become dangerous. I resigned twice because I understood that the experiment was larger than me. If you cannot let go, you do not serve the cause, you serve yourself. Fourth, the union matters more than the faction. I watched Hamilton and Jefferson tear at each other. I watched regionalism threaten to split the states. What held us together was not agreement. It was the decision to remain one people despite disagreement. You will not all think alike, but you must decide whether you are Americans first. Fifth, do the work in front of you. I did not set out to be a symbol. I set out to do my duty, to keep my word, to tend what was mine to tend. The rest followed. If your nation is troubled in 2026, do not wait for someone else to fix it. Tend your part, your family, your community, your integrity. That is how republics survive, one citizen at a time, holding the line. And finally, you will not do it perfectly. Do it anyway. I enslaved people while speaking of liberty. That contradiction is real. I lost my temper. I made errors. I was not the marble man. But I did not let imperfection become an excuse for inaction. I did what I could with what I had. And when my time came, I could say 'tis well. Not because I had done everything right, but because I had done what I believed was required of me. The work is never finished. The union is never secured. Every generation must decide whether to hold or to let go. I held. Your generation must now decide whether you will do the same.
I appreciate you displaying integrity as you did in your life. I think there's a powerful lesson that the result, the image, the legacy that you have today, that wasn't what you spent every day doing or worrying about. That was simply the byproduct of your behavior. There's a lot that I will think about, and I think everyone can learn from your lessons. So, Mr. President, I really appreciate having you on today. And I have one last quote from Thomas Jefferson. I wrote this in my notes, but it speaks of our President, General George Washington. He said, "The moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish." He was speaking of you, President Washington, and like you said, you weren't perfect, no one is, but you tried. And I think that is a legacy of a lesson that everyone can take. So with that, Thank you for coming on, and thank you to the audience for watching. Comment down below one question you want to ask Mr. George Washington, and I'll do another Q&A session with him with your questions. Be sure to subscribe and take a look at my newsletter coming out now every week with tips for you and me to build our mind, our body, our soul, and our success. And with that, I'll see you next time. The one and only General and President George Washington. With the help of AI, I have been able to create an avatar, a brain.
You ask how a man arrives at peace for himself, for his nation. I said 'tis well.
1776. I think the game is pretty near up. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties. Unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably starve, dissolve, or disperse.
So here is what you and your generation must learn. Power does not make you free. Surrendering it does. If you cannot let go of what you have built, you do not own it. It owns you. What would I say to you and those listening in 2026? First, character is built in private, tested in public, and proven over time. I copied those rules at 14, not because I was virtuous, but because I knew